Remember when I said he was smart and I was willing to hear him out?
Blossom.
What's up, guys? Today I'm reacting to Schmidt's new video on Ash Blossom. My friend sent me it and told me I needed to watch it, so I thought I'd share my thoughts with you guys. Let's get right into it.
What is up, duelists, and welcome to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. Today we have a very interesting discussion, at least I hope so. I've been having this discussion with people on my stream already, and I wanted to make a more structured video on it, and that is the concept of Yu-Gi-Oh cards aging very poorly. And I want to look at this a little bit in general, but most importantly with the most recent semi-limit of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring in the OCG, and I want to talk about a little bit why I think that was such a good hit, and maybe try to bring across the concept of why Ash Blossom has not aged as well as people think it has, and why I actually think putting it to 2 or even lower in future ban lists would be a phenomenal hit for the TCG as well.
Okay, so at face value, if you watched my OCG Banlist reaction, like, I kind of disagree with this on principle, but I'm willing to hear him out. Like, I really like Josh, and I think that he's super smart, obviously, when it comes to the game, so let's see what he has to say.
And I'm mainly doing this because people seemed to be a little bit confused, even though I tried to explain why I think it's a good hit in my OCG Banlist reaction video. But I felt like iterating over it more is something that I should do, because people still ask those kind of questions as to why I think Ash Blossom is a card that should be hit on the ban list. Of course, people asking questions of like, why I think Ash Blossom is a completely fair card. Why should it get hit? You know, it's a hand trap, so it helps the player going second, obviously, right? And that's a couple of things I want to talk about. Before we hop in, I want to just rant a little bit about the general concept of cards aging badly in Yu-Gi-Oh! And what I mean by this, what I mean when I say this, is that sometimes a card is printed with a certain idea in mind, and it does just fine for the time that it's released in.
So, like, I think an example of this would be like a Rise Heart as a direct counter to Tier. Like, it did what it was supposed to do, but it wasn't good for the game overall.
Popular examples of cards that were completely fine when they were printed, but then end up aging very poorly.
Like,
we're not going to go over every single example. You can probably pick a card from almost any time of Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, and that has aged poorly. But some of my favorite examples of this are Anti-Spell Fragrance, because this card came out in 2004 or 2003 actually, as you can see down here, and in a time, of course, where Yu-Gi-Oh was a lot slower and it wasn't actually that big of a deal having to set your spells first. This card didn't see any play for the longest time of Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan. Actually, it started seeing play only 2016 or 15 when Pendulum entered the fray, which is 12 years after it was printed. Before then, it was only very rarely played, and the uses for this card were actually quite cool in the beginning. And believe it or not, like one of the ways this card was used was in Gladiator Beasts, where forcing your opponent to set their power spells and then summoning Gladiator Beast Geyseris or Gladiator Beast Bestiari to pop it was like a genuine strategy that was pretty cool at the time. But of course, the introduction of Pendulum, but also just the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh has gotten faster and faster over the years, has turned this card into basically a game-ending turn skip immediately, which is why it has aged very poorly and is now basically an auto-win button in a lot of formats, which has gotten it limited, but a lot of people are arguing, of course, it should be banned. And then another, of course, even more prevalent example is Maxi, you know, a card that, believe it or not, was absolutely fine when it came out in 2011. I know it's hard to imagine for people nowadays, but for the longest time, Maxi was a completely fine and balanced card that for multiple formats after it's been printed didn't even make its way into every single main deck. Like, people would either side deck this card or not play it at all in certain formats, because it just wasn't good against every deck, and it was more like it was meant to be more like a punish to some strategies that were doing way too much, but it was not good against everything. And once again, this has obviously changed, and nowadays every single Yu-Gi-Oh deck special summons a lot, and you cannot afford to give up that one turn, and therefore Maxi is a super powerful card that now finally has been limited in the OCG, is still at 2 in Master Duel, but thank God it's banned in the TCG, and hopefully should be banned anywhere soon. But that's what I mean or some of the examples that I can make when I say a card has aged poorly. And that leads us to the most recent.
You know, obviously I said a Rise Heart, and I think that that is a card that would age badly if it were still around. But I agree with his examples of Anti-Spell and Maxi aging badly and being cards that were designed for a different form of Yu-Gi-Oh! But one thing I would say that unifies Maxi and Anti-Spell and even Arise Heart is like their lingering effects that affect multiple cards that your opponent plays. Maxi interacts with multiple instances of special summoning. Anti-Spell interacts with every spell that your opponent could potentially play. Arise Heart banishes every card that resolves while its Floodgate is being applied. But Ash is a 1-for-1 card, so I want to see how he differentiates between these. I'm still open to the argument, but I'm curious.
OCG Forbidden Limited List update that has, among other things, limited Maxi, finally, limited Called by the Grave, and also semi-limited Ash Blossom. And when I reacted to this ban list, I said that I had been thinking about making this exact video that you're watching right now about Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. And I talked about that a little bit already, but I still wanted to make this video and explain why. Because I think this happening actually in the OCG is a pretty good sign of Konami understanding what the concepts that I'm about to talk to you about. And makes me hopeful that we will get this at some point in the TCG as well. Now, the reason why I feel like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring has aged pretty poorly in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that what this card started out as is, well, what it is, a hand trap. It was meant to give the player going second a better chance of preventing some things that the opponent was doing, and I think that is fundamentally a good idea. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game, I hope we can all agree that for 99.9% of Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, the player going first is favored. You know, it was always preferred to go first in Yu-Gi-Oh! With
Absolutely agree. I talk about this in a lot of different videos. Yeah, you know how I feel about this.
Very, very, very few exceptions. You know, of course, they made decks like Tenpai, or more recently Gem Knights, or, you know, in Necros format, because of Necros of Trishula, there was a period where you would make the opponent go first and stuff like that. But for the most part, with very few exceptions, going first is strong in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right? And a lot of their job in Yu-Gi-Oh's design team is trying to make new cards and new archetypes, of course, that are more powerful than previous archetypes, because we do not have rotation. So the only balancing tool that they have is the Forbidden and Limited list, as well as the new archetypes that they make. So sometimes when they make archetypes too powerful, they hit them on the ban list, and then other times they just make more powerful archetypes. As a result, the player going first in Yu-Gi-Oh! Usually is at an advantage, because decks are getting more and more powerful, and the player going first is the first one to resolve their cards, usually, right? That's, I think, the initial reasoning for hand traps to exist in the first place, right? And I think as the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community has developed this kind of like general understanding of like, well, hand traps are healthy because the player going second should get a chance to interact with the player going first, and cards that negate hand traps, like Called by the Grave and Crossout Designator, or punish hand traps like Triple Tactics Talents by looking at their hand and taking away more copies of hand traps, generally are pretty powerful and benefit the player going first a lot, which is why a lot of people, myself included, always advocated for those cards being a bad design and they should be banned. You know, cards like Called by the Grave, even though the player going second has a chance of using it on their own turn, of course, it disproportionately favors the player going first by taking interaction away from their opponent.
And I totally agree with this. Like, I don't like Called by at all. I don't like Triple Tack at all. I don't even really like Thrust at all. I think that hand traps should like generally do what's printed on the card, and your opponent should have to play around it, have the out, have the extender. In some cases, like I like K9 and how they interact with hand traps, but even like Ripper is really powerful, you know?
That is, of course, a problem. And of course, there's some decks that suffer from hand traps. You know, some decks that are older or have bigger choke points because they're not as power crept as newer archetypes. And so there is some older decks that rely on cards like Called by the Grave to negate the opponent's hand traps. But, you know, keeping a deck from years ago in the meta because it cannot beat like a simple Ash Blossom without access to Called by the Grave is not generally worth the trade-off of the top meta decks from these days also getting to ignore the hand traps by the use of Called by the Grave. So that's kind of like the core argument as to why I think Called by the Grave is a card that is a type of effect that is generally pretty bad to be in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the player going first is already naturally favored to win the game. And so non-engine, in my opinion, should be favoring the player going second more than the player going first.
And I totally agree with that. 100%, no notes. Non-engine should be a concession that you play in contrast to engine. Your engine should be cards that are good when you're playing proactively. Your non-engine should generally be cards that are good when you're playing interactively.
And that leads us to Ash Blossom's basically role in Yu-Gi-Oh! For the majority of its lifespan, which is that it was seen as one of the premier hand traps for the player going second, which is what it was when it came out. You know, it was a great card. A lot of decks had very meaningful Ash Blossom choke points, very powerful cards that the player going first would try to resolve. Let it be a Pot of Desires or a Card of Demise or anything of that nature. Or in a lot of combos, there was very important choke points, like an Isolde in a Goki combo or something like that, right? Where it was clear that there was one specific step of that combo or one specific powerful spell card that the player going second was able to stop, and therefore giving them a higher chance of winning than had they not had the Ash Blossom. And this is something that was why Ash Blossom was such a good card for such a long time. However, the role of Ash Blossom has changed in recent years, and especially in 2024 and 2025. If you look at the current top tier decks in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, or also the current top tier decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, this being the 3 top decks used by Ryan Yu to win the most recent Duelist Cup, it was Ryziel, Mitsurugi, it was Malice, and it was Onomat Ryziel, whereas of course in the TCG at the moment, some of the top tier decks include also Malice, Vanquish Soul K9, Pure Yami, Yami Mitsurugi, and so on and so forth, as well as Draco Tail. The majority of these decks generally don't really have a huge choke point for Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring anymore. The general, and this is natural because Ash Blossom was a card that was everywhere. So of course, in order to sell new archetypes, in order to design new archetypes that don't suffer as much from Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, they have simply made these decks that are better into Ash Blossom when they go first. There is almost no deck right now that gets consistently stopped by Ash Blossom when it goes first.
And if you watched my video about hand traps, you'll know, like, I really feel like we need a hand trap that stops an effect that sets or activates a spell trap directly from the deck, because that's the new proactive effect that dodges Ash that all of these meta decks are accessing to make it invalid against them.
Starting with stuff like Malice that doesn't even care about the card at all, because the entire gimmick of the deck is banishing from the deck and then summoning from banished, which basically is a fancy way of summoning a monster from your deck, but it circumvents Ash Blossom completely. Or even decks like Ryziel that started out having a clear choke point for Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Ryziel Duo Drive, where that immediately gets fixed one set after, because they didn't want it to have that choke point apparently, which generally I think having choke points is a pretty healthy thing. But
and I agree, combos should have choke points. We should be able to 1-for-1 our opponent and force an extender.
Ryziel came out, and now you could no longer safely hold your Ash Blossom for Ryziel Duo Drive, because they would just have Ryziel cross beforehand, and therefore completely invalidating Ash Blossom on Duo Drive. So you were left with basically one option and one option only, which is if they normal summon Ice Ryziel, you just Ash it, and you hope your opponent does not have an extender. And guess what? That little mini game that you play with your opponent is not very interesting, because when you Ash an Ice Ryziel and they already have a Sword Ryziel in hand, not only did you lose your Ash Blossom, but your opponent is also going to do basically the exact same combo that they were going to do anyways. Your Ash Blossom had 0 impact because you did not hit a choke point that they can't like replace with another effect, right?
So I feel kind of mixed on this, because I feel like, yes, there should be multiple points to use a given hand trap during a combo. Like, I think Imperm is a really good example of this. Like, you can Imperm the normal summon, you can Imperm the Link one, you can Imperm the M board going into it, going second, because you drew it and you don't control any cards. Like, I think we should be able to Ash at multiple points in the combo too, like Ashing the Branded Fusion, or Ashing the Rahu, or Ashing the Ketu. Like, all of these are valid depending on what you think is in your opponent's hand. And so, like, while he's saying, yeah, it doesn't feel good to Ash the Ice Ryziel when they already have Sword, I think that 1-for-1ing and hand trapping and demanding an extender is, like, I wouldn't call that boring or unfun. Like, I would say, depending on the number of hand traps in your deck, it can become a valid strategy, because you interrupt your opponent's proactive play through critical mass, and then you like stop those developmental pieces from ever hitting the board. There are a lot of decks that benefit from their extra deck monsters just leaving the extra deck, whether or not their effects resolve, because they can be brought back with a reborn or something like that. And so like I do agree that this like lottery guessing game of hand trap or no hand trap, turn ender or no turn ender does suck sometimes, but I don't really think of Ash as a turn ender. And I think that like, you know, Schmidt kind of said that when he said there's no real deck that loses to a single Ash.
If they have that extender, they are going to do all the things they were going to do anyways. But now you have 4 cards in hand instead of 5. That is an awful exchange. And it generally is considered, or I consider it to be bad gameplay. And this is something that is the case in so many other matchups. I mean, of course, you look at cards like K9 Noroi, you have no choice. You Ash Blossom that thing. Because if you don't Ash Blossom that K9 Noroi, then it summons another monster that searches another monster, and then summons Ripper, which is literally made to negate hand traps, right? So it's very apparent that with modern use...
Or if you don't want to play into the Droll, you make the Ripper first, use Ripper to attach to the Jokel, search Lantern, bring the Jokel back off the Lantern, and you have the Ripper to cover yourself from Droll. But like either way, yeah, it's problematic. But like, you can Ash the Noroi. And like, we agree Ash is kind of unimpactful. So like, he's going to say defensive play against Mulchies, and I'm going to say I like it, even though it is kind of like lotto sacky. Like, I'd like to have another way to protect specifically against Mulchies.
Yu-Gi-Oh decks, when you go second against them, Ash Blossom is a very, very mediocre way of handling any of their plays. You know, it is not reliable. The amount of hand traps that you have to draw to consistently stop these decks is absurd. In the example where you have an Ash Blossom against the Ice Ryzeal and they have a sword in hand, there is no other hand trap that you can really pair with that Ash Blossom to make it feel like you have meaningfully impacted their turn, unless it is a Floodgate hand trap like Droll and Lockbird, or it is a meaningful hand trap that doesn't trade just 1 for 1, right? And that's the most important topic that we're going to get to, is also the Mulcharmies and what kind of role they play in this sort of exchange. But if you have another 1 for 1 trade hand trap like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence in this scenario, you know, you Ash the Ice Ryzeal, they special summon Sword, you Imperm the Sword, that's 2 level 4s, that still makes Duo Drive. So at this point, you are trading exceptionally bad into the Ryzeal deck with your...
I might just, like, at that point, if they played through the Ash, hold the Imperm for my own turn. But I don't know.
Hand traps, right? Because they just keep going. They have a starter and an extender. You have 2 hand traps. They play through it like it's no problem. And this is something that is very natural. You know, when they give us more hand traps that we play with, if they make new archetypes that they want us to play, then of course they're going to make them good into the type of non-engine that people play. But that basically calls for more now non-engine, right? Which is the sort of situation that we are in right now. Of course, they have offered us other options in terms of non-engine. You know, Yu-Gi-Oh is headed in a direction where non-engine is changing. You know, we are no longer it's no longer just cards like Ash Blossom that we have for going second, but we are getting new kind of cards in the Mulcharmies these days, and so on and so forth. And well, you might ask yourself, why are people even playing Ash Blossom if it is such a mediocre card for going second, which it genuinely is. It is a very mediocre card going second in modern Yu-Gi-Oh. You draw 1 Ash Blossom and a bunch of engine cards going second, the game is almost certainly lost these days.
I don't know. I mean, like, he definitely knows better than I do. Maybe I'm just being wishful at this point, but I feel like ashing the branded fusion still feels good. Like,
which on the one hand is a problem with the power level that certain decks operate at, which this discussion is not really about, but that is also a valid argument. You know, decks are doing too much in certain circumstances. Obviously, you know, the Onomat Ryzeal or the Mitsurugi Yami deck or whatever, like some of those decks are definitely gifted with a little bit too high of a ceiling, 100%. That's not the topic of today's video, though. The topic is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. So why are people playing Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring if it is such a mediocre card going second? So, well, the one reason, the first and smaller reason is that it's very versatile, and it is one of, even though it is not likely to work, it is still one of your best bets. You know, sometimes when your opponent plays a deck like Onomat Ryzeal that does unthinkable things to you if you let one of their cards resolve, the best chance is trying to not let them resolve a card, which isn't very interesting gameplay wise. And you literally pray every time you have just one Ash Blossom. You pray it's enough. Just hit the first card and hope they pass. But sometimes it works. Sometimes it works. So like it's literally like you grasp that straw. You take it and you hope it works. But the more important reason is Ash Blossom is insane when you go first. Because what is one of the ways you can actually discourage your opponent from making that full board? It's Mulcharmies. And in Master Duel and OCG's world, it is Max C, but that card should not be legal for another reason that we're going to talk about in a second. Mulcharmies do exactly what I want non-engine to do in the current Yu-Gi-Oh! Environment. They benefit the player going second exclusively. If you go first, you cannot make use of Mulcharmies.
Am I going to actively change my mind over the course of the video? I don't know. I get it. Ashing a Mulcharmy does feel disgusting, but like there's so many Mulcharmies in the game and you can activate 2 in a turn. But like, yeah, Fua is the most impactful and they're always going to Ash the Fua when it comes down. But like, I don't know. I don't know if this changes my mind 100%. I understand the argument. I do. I want to say this argument holds water. I'm not going to be like, oh, this is so... like, I want to validate this for sure. Like, it's real. It feels gross to have your Mulcharmy get ashed, for sure.
And that is another thing with non-engine in general. With Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks being so good at going first naturally, I think non-engine is problematic when it is also really good to back up an already established pretty strong board. You know, when the player going first, you all know this, when the player going first drops a Nibiru on you, or when the player going first has a Droll and Lockbird in hand, or also sometimes as simple as just throwing an Ash Blossom next to your already pretty strong board, it feels often very, very hard to beat and sometimes completely unbeatable. Which, you know, in the case of Nibiru or Droll and Lockbird, maybe some decks have solid plans into them when you go, like when they go first. You know, like maybe you are able to figure out a cool line to outplay Droll and Lockbird or Nibiru when you are able to go first. But when your opponent goes first and makes any kind of board and has these cards in hand, it just becomes borderline impossible. And I think this is one of the most important things about the Mulcharmies, is that they do not work when you already have a board. And I think that is a very important factor when we're looking at non-engine design for the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! I understand that some decks are hit harder by Charmies than others, but this is a very natural process in Yu-Gi-Oh! You know, sometimes new non-engine comes out and some decks are bad into it, and that's why they phase out. That does not necessarily mean Mulcharmies are badly designed just because...
This is a really good and important point to make. Agree.
Some rogue decks die to them. You know, there's just as many rogue decks that can't play through an Ash Blossom. But Charmies inherently do a couple of pretty cool things. First of all, they work only going second, which I think is very important, like I just said. But they also don't just negate a card. I think this type of, and this is something that I guess doesn't get talked about enough. At the moment, this sort of like Ash Blossom, Impulse, Imperm, Veiler, whatever gameplay, I personally, and this is subjective, you can let me know what you think about this, but I find it very uninteresting if the way you win going second is to just trade 1-for-1 hand traps with your opponent's starters, and you basically just say like, hey, I got 3 hand trap negates. How many starters you got? Oh, is that just 2? Well, I guess you're not playing the game. And then sometimes you're like, oh, I just have 2 hand traps. How many starters you got? Oh, 3? I guess I lose.
So I see this side of the argument, absolutely, and I appreciate that he says it's a subjective point, because I also agree it's a subjective point, but I would approach it from the other side, where I would say not all starters are created equal and not all decks lose to the same hand traps in the same way. And so having a mastery of the format and understanding the context of your hand in terms of the non-engine pieces you open going second can help you to dismantle the board before it's created, or to encourage your opponent into a certain line of play by cutting off certain points. I would argue like the same argument could be made about choke points in combos, where like, oh, if I draw Ash and you're on this archetype and you go through this line and I Ash you here, your turn is over. Like, I would rather 1-for-1 with a hand trap and check for an extender and see if there's more opportunities for interaction between the players than just be like, every single time I hand trap at this point, the turn is over and it's mine. I see both sides, though. I can see the side that's like, well, when I put interaction into my deck, I want to know for sure that it's going to do something materially in stopping my opponent. But at the same time, it's a 2-player game. everything should have an opportunity cost, if you ask me. And like 1-for-1s are the most cut and dry way to create opportunity cost for both players. The discard is tantamount to the card that it's negating. Then both players have X amount of cards left after that interaction has, happened.
Because as soon as you resolve a card, that's going to lead you to so much card advantage. And I now only have 3 cards left in hand. I'm going to draw a 4th card, but I don't think I can overcome what you do after all that. So I guess you win. I think it's not interesting. So I think one of the, and honestly, this is a result of Yu-Gi-Oh's design philosophy changing over the years. It's not, I don't think it's a cycle. I think it's more like a progression, like we had games, we had decks once upon a time that had meaningful choke points, where cards like Ash Blossom and Imperm could be used in meaningful ways, where you would let the opponent play a little bit, get to a certain part of their board, then Ash a key thing or Imperm a key thing on their end board, and there was a fine game of Yu-Gi-Oh to be played. That is not really where we are right now. I think most Yu-Gi-Oh decks just do too much for you to hold these cards for certain points, for certain interact. These days, 99% of the time, the right point to use your hand traps is as early as possible and hope they don't play. And I think that is not interesting.
And when it devolves into that, I totally do agree. When you're just shooting in the dark, when there's no nuance to when the hand trap is used, yeah, I agree you've reached a point where it's a problem. But I would maybe posit the claim that we're not quite there yet. Like, being selective about what to ash against Yamimitsu is still valid. Like, you either want to ash the Cupsy Way, or you want to ash the Ritual from deck, or maybe even ash the Saji Search once they've tributed off. Like, you don't necessarily have choke points, but you have hard once per turns to play around.
And this is where cards like the Mulcharmies come in, and actually just like, they discourage your opponent from going for their full combo. And I say full combo because Mulcharmies against all top meta decks at the moment do not discourage them from playing at all, which is one of the main differences between Mulcharmies and Max C. There are decks right here, and this is true for all of the top tier decks here. They are all capable of making very solid end boards under Mulcharmies. Some of the best Yu-Gi-Oh at the moment happens under Mulcharmies. The best Yu-Gi-Oh probably happens under Mulcharmies. Vanquish Soul can easily set up a Ripper that sets the quick play spell plus some of the Vanquish Soul disruptions in 1 or 2 Mulcharmy draws. Malice, if they start with a good normal summon or a Gold Sark or the field spell or whatever, against Mulcharmy Fuwalos or Perulia can sometimes give 1 or 0 draws to still end on Hard Scripter plus the trap to non-target banish 2 of your opponent's cards plus whatever non-engine they've drawn, while giving the opponent 0 or 1 draw out of their Charmies.
It's still good card design, and it's still good archetype design. Like, I don't know. This is fun Yu-Gi-Oh, if you ask me. And he said it. He said it's the best Yu-Gi-Oh. I think we agree on that.
It's just that, like, they can't go for the full crazy combo if they do that. Yami is a deck that can very well play under almost any Charmy. Like, it discourages them from going for the full combo, but they can set up pretty good boards with a lot of interaction on your turn. Mitsurugi, same thing. Reiko Tail doesn't even care about the Mulcharmies. Mulcharmies are simply not unhealthy in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This is something you need to understand. If you have a problem with Mulcharmies, it is likely that you are playing a deck that simply doesn't have a good plan B, or you're simply maybe scared to actually play Yu-Gi-Oh! With your opponent. You need your deck to make an auto-win board in order to win the game. But realistically, all of these decks play very solid Yu-Gi-Oh! Against Charmies. They do not auto-lose, and the Charmy does not end the game for any of them.
This is such a W take. Like, just take this and put it everywhere. Like, actually just clip this and put it everywhere.
Which leads me to the reason why Ash Blossom is being played. It simply is the best way to ignore Mulcharmies at the moment. The number one reason for all of these decks to play Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is to delete 1 card out of your opponent's hand when you go first, and basically rob them of any chance in participating in the game. Because, well, you don't have to worry about making that half board. You don't have to risk your opponent having a strong engine hand and being able to play into your board with maybe 1 or 2 extra cards, when you can just ash the Mulcharmy, because your deck is built to already play through Ash Blossom or Imperm or Veiler or whatever super well. So if you just draw an Ash Blossom to negate your opponent's Mulcharmy, you ignore that part of their deck as well, and you can just normal summon your Dormouse, you can normal summon your Noroi, or normal summon your Dormouse, normal summon your Neptibus, activate your Dodododo Warrior, normal summon your Cupsy Yummy, You name it, all of these cards.
Okay, he's right. Okay, but I don't like. Have I turned the corner on whether Ash should be banned or not? Like,
trade incredibly well into all kind of 1-for-1 hand traps, and so as long as you can negate the Charmy, you win the game. And so you might not like this, but if you've been following my arguments here, it's pretty clear. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring.
You might not like
is
this. It's like a truck, dude.
The function of this card in modern Yu-Gi-Oh is Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave is a card that is not that good going second. Usually, you can use it sometimes, but it's not likely to win you the game if your opponent goes full combo anyways. Ash
Remember when I said he was smart and I was willing to hear him out?
Blossom is the same thing. Ash Blossom is very mediocre when you go second on average at the moment against all of these decks in the format, but when you go first, it becomes a god card. Just like Called by the Grave, it checks your opponent's most powerful hand traps, and if you don't need it, if you can combo anyways because your opponent didn't draw a Mulcharmy, well, I guess I'm making a full board and I have an Ash on top of it. Try to beat that. I guess you won't. Ash Blossom is literally Called by the Grave. So, and this is, I think, a perfect example of a card just not aging well. This card was a card that helped the player going second once upon a time when decks had meaningful choke points, but it is not that anymore. It is simply not that anymore. And I guess that's what I've been trying to get across here. I'm not trying to ramble for too long, even though people, I know people like these sort of like in-depth card design discussions. That's why I really wanted to make that video. And so that is, I guess, my point here. And feel free to let me know about a couple of things. But like, I guess the main statements that I wanted to get across are, number one, I believe the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! With archetypes getting more and more powerful, which I've come to terms with combo decks existing. I've come to terms with one-card combos. You know, I've spoken my piece on this sort of stuff, you know, but if that stuff has to exist, if combos have to exist, if people love these kind of playstyles and they make decks like this, there needs to be counterplay. And if the player going first is so favored if they resolve their combo, non-engine in the game needs to favor the player going second. It needs to help the player going second disproportionately more than the player going first, you know, and that is my problem.
And so because Mulcharmies are good for the game, which we agree about, and because Ash is less good going second because than it is going first because it's like, if Ash said except by drawing.
With cards like Nibiru and Droll, which Nibiru technically promotes healthier gameplay when you draw it going second. You know, it forces the opponent to play around it, and sometimes, like a lot of decks these days are actually designed to like play around Nibiru to an extent, but you can usually still use it to make their board weaker. Like Yami is a good example of this. Like you can usually prevent the Herald of the Arclight, for example, if you want to with Nibiru against Yami. Like it'll always be live. So Nibiru going second, I would classify as a relatively healthy card. And even Droll and Lockbird, when you go second, is probably fine for the game. Like the player going second, drawing Droll and Lockbird is fair, I think.
Agree.
The problem with both of these cards is that they become basically unbeatable when the player going first draws them.
Yeah, adding a floodgate to your end board is so cursed.
Because they have no clause that prevents them from being used when you go first. And so this is what differentiates the Mulcharmies from cards like Nibiru, Droll, and also Max C. You know, this is something that Max C is completely lacking. Because any ability to make any half board under Max C is completely out of the window when your opponent has already set up a full board. Like you can't just go IP pass or whatever you do against Max C in your deck. If your opponent already has a full board, it's not an option. So you just lose to it. I think more ways to help the player going second are the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! In order to balance things a little bit. And I believe Ash Blossom is a little bit out of place now because they've realized already that like they need to stop making these one-on-one interactions because it just doesn't work well when people are summoning cards like Noroi or Dormouse or Ice or the Dodo or Neptibus or Cupsy. Like none of these cards like you can stop with one-on-one hand traps. It simply does not work. So we need cards like the Mulcharmies. We need cards like Phimena as well. You know, Phimena and Holy Sue and stuff like that are all
and Cool Tune Clip.
Great examples of this. And Ash Blossom has basically been downgraded to like a Called by the Grave in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I hope I was able to get that point across. I hope everyone had
Oh my lord, this video was so good. Yep, you were able to get the point across. Yep.
or had fun watching the discussion, I guess. Please let me know in the comments down below what you think of this. Was I able to get my points across clear? Do you agree with what I'm saying? If not, then why not? Because I feel like I've made some pretty good points here, but maybe you disagree. Let me know why. But yeah, this video is probably releasing around Christmas time, so if you're seeing this around the Christmas holidays, then Merry Christmas to you all if you celebrate, or if not, I just wish you some happy holidays or some nice days off work or whatever. Thank you so much for watching. We're probably gonna have like an end of the year recap streams.
All right, so I think he's probably just gonna do like channel stuff on his to-do list after that. I'll watch the rest after and add anything that comes up. But I do want to say, like, he probably convinced me that Ash could be banned and replaced with a similar card, but I do want to see a generic hand trap that stops summoning from the deck or that stops Foolish Burial style effects, because I think the other modes of Ash are really valuable for the game. Even if we feel like they're weak into the current meta, I do want it to exist on a card, but I don't think that stopping the Mulcharmies is a good thing. I think that's my least favorite use case for Ash. I think that it's valuable that it forces the turn player to discard a hand trap, but like he said, a lot of decks don't care because they just go full combo after. That's a valid criticism. I see both sides. Like, I really want to keep the interaction in the game, so as long as Konami prints something similar to replace it that doesn't stop the Mulcharmies in that way, I think I'm on the same page, and that he did change my mind. But it is like it's a contentious mind changing. It's tenuous on like something else coming out, but maybe that's an unnecessary thing. Maybe we just need better going second cards, like you said. I'm open-minded. I think it was a great video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, got something out of my reaction, and I'll see you next time.